Chapter 38 Bloodstained Love Letters. Before Jessie went home to Blaine Lake, the police had confiscated the Wilsons' 2 trunks and left them in the room where Jack and Jessie had stayed. The unlocked trunk held only clothes and a few household items. The other was locked and its key lost or taken home by Jessie. At the Grand Hotel, Provincial Police Assistant Superintendent William Tracy, a tall, lean Scot with a sharp mind and dour sense of humor, watched as Sergeant Corby tried and discarded key after key, finally shaking his head and standing up. "It's no go with any of these, sir." "All right, Sergeant, round up some more keys, and if we have to, we'll break the lock." Constable Scotney, in her room at the Blaine Lake Hotel, stood up as Jessie entered the room, gripping her father's arm. She appeared unwell and pale, but she walked erect and looked Constable Scotney in the eye. He pulled out a chair for her. "Please sit down, Mrs. Wilson. You too, Mr. Patterson." They sat, with Scotney at a small table facing them. "I realize this is very difficult for you, ma'am. It won't take long." "That's good. Jessie is in a very... She can't take much more right now," John Patterson said. "I understand. I mainly wanted to ask you, Mrs. Wilson, if you know where we might locate your husband's shotgun." She shook her head. "I don't know where it is. He lent it to an inspector in Vancouver to go duck shooting." "When was that? Do you remember?" "Just this fall sometime." "And do you know his name?" "No, I don't." There was a trace of anger in her voice, at what or whom Constable Scotney could not tell. Perhaps just at circumstances. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. I appreciate your coming down." John Patterson stayed behind a moment. "Jessie will answer questions later. It's just that she's very delicate right now. Her mother or I have to be with her all the time." Conrad Reed's statement arrived on Commissioner Perry's desk. It was startling in its revelation that John Wilson had told him that he and Jessie would be married on the evening of September 27. Reed recounted the episode of the missing Colt pistol, which he later found in Wilson's desk, and then the shotgun. "I first saw the 12-gauge shotgun in the office of John Wilson in the armory in Saskatoon. Wilson invariably took the shotgun with him when making a trip into the country with his car, and it kicked around in the bottom of the car about as much as it did in the office, or rather in the bottom of the car that was burned, and also the car that replaced the one which was burned." Reed describes cleaning the gun when it was left at his place. "I am satisfied I should know the gun again." Detailed description here. "The maker was Parker of Edinburgh. I knew nothing of Wilson's home affairs, but believed from remarks he had made from time to time that his mother and father were both dead, and that he had lost a sister in France during the war, and not very long ago had lost his only other sister who died in Scotland, that he had a brother in England who had been made prisoner by the Germans but had escaped in the fall of 1918 and who stood small chance of recovery from his wounds." Reed's statement points up Wilson's tendency to lie when he wanted something and to fabricate stories about his tragic siblings, who were in reality all alive and well back in Scotland, and had not heard a word from Jack since 1914. Wilson, still at the police hospital, improved daily, and police planned to move him to the Regina jail at the end of the week. Men from the SPP combed through the rubbish at the Corey nuisance ground for the remains of the burned car. The newspapers duly reported. The rubbish heaps in Corey nuisance ground yielded broken, flame-scarred parts which were identified as belonging to Wilson's car. But what the police were really looking for, the portion of the tonneau wall which a bullet is believed to have penetrated, had not been discovered at press time. And an SPP constable spent day after day showing Wilson's photograph at every hardware and general store in Wilson's large territory in the hopes that a clerk would say, "I know that man. He bought a shovel here." Back at the Grand Hotel, the 7th key was tried, and click, it worked. Sergeant Corby smiled up at Assistant Superintendent Tracy. "Lucky 7, he said, and, lifting the lid, carefully opened Wilson's trunk all the way back. On the left side of the tray lay a brown leather dispatch bag, filthy, scorched, and covered with blood. "Good God," breathed Bill Tracy as he hunkered his long frame down for a closer look. "Does that look like blood to you, Corby?" "I would say so, sir." They looked at each other and smiled. "Well, let's have a look inside." Carefully he undid the straps and lifted the flap. Tracy whistled at the sight. Thick, crusted blood had stuck the scorched flap and straps to the case. The marks showing that the bag had been opened long after the blood dried were clearly visible in a thick, dark outline. "I think we just may have our murder witness, Sergeant," he said. "You'd better take notes as I examine the contents." "Yes, sir." Sergeant Corby produced notebook and pen and pulled a chair up to the open trunk. Tracy reached for a large blue envelope in the inside pocket of the case. It had been stuck to the leather at one time. The front of the envelope and its contents liberally stained with what appeared to be blood. Tracy drew out the contents, all military police papers, a copy of the Military Service Act 1917, a quantity of forms used in enforcing it, copies of reports submitted by Wilson, circular descriptions of persons wanted under the MSA, and other papers. As he looked at each paper, he identified it to Sergeant Corby, who listed it. Tracy then opened another pocket in the bag, also stained inside, and spread the contents of a large, bulky envelope out on the hotel room floor. They were obviously personal letters, most of them addressed to Jesse Patterson in Blaine Lake and Prince Albert, and some addressed from Jesse to Wilson in Regina, Saskatoon, and other places. Tracy pulled out the letters and laid them down on their envelopes. "My dearest Jessie, dearest wee girl, my darling Jessie." There were a lot of them, some in Wilson's handwriting, some typed on an office typewriter. Most were from Wilson to Jessie, with hers to him much more restrained in salutation. "Dear Jack," or once, "Dearest Jack." A quantity of personal letters, Tracy dictated, his voice barely able to contain his excitement, from Jack Wilson to Jesse Patterson and vice versa, covering a period from, he scanned the letters, the early part of 1917 until the date of their marriage in late September 1918. Many of the letters were also stained with the same substance which had at some time oozed into the openings of the case and onto the papers. "We'll submit these to Dr. Charlton tomorrow." C.M. Charlton was the coroner and provincial analyst. "If it's human blood, Wilson's going to have to think of something besides a cut finger." "Should I say let's hope it is?" "Might as well say it as think it," said Tracy, "and I'd lay money on whose it is." "No takers," Sergeant Corby said. "But why would he hang on to it?" "That's what I'd like to know." Tracy lifted the tray and saw a quantity of ladies' clothes, blankets, a coffee pot, and other household articles, all neatly packed. He felt through them without disturbing the neat contents too much. His wife must have seen it. It looks as if she packed the trunk. How the devil would he explain the condition of the case? Anybody would think it was blood. "He must have concocted some story, sir." "Yes, Wilson is quick with a story, I gather, and it was duck hunting time. He might have said he'd thrown some ducks or geese on top of it." "Possibly, and it seems as if she believed everything he said, both before and after they were married." Tracy began returning the letters to their envelopes. "I'll read these at the office." He glanced at the letter he'd just picked up. "Listen to this, Sergeant. I am almost a free man now, dearest. Just a few more days. I may have been married and had to get a divorce, but thank God, even if I am no Christian, I can look back to a miserable life and say I never harmed a miserable girl in my life. What an honorable man, our Sergeant Wilson, and look at the way he signs his letters. Your honest, faithful, and true Jack Boy." Tracy picked up one after another, his voice incredulous and amused. "Your loving, kind, and true Jack Boy. And listen to this one. Your honest, clean, and true Jack." At this, both men burst out laughing. "Clean too? Well, how could she resist him?" Tracy said. "How could she believe him, you mean?" Well, she was young, wasn't she? Very young and very gullible. Poor girl. Poor first wife, I say. Yes, indeed, both of them. Tracy was scanning through some of the letters. Well, we've got him by the short hairs, I think, with these. He talks about marrying this girl in just about every letter, most of them written before his wife conveniently died. Excuse me. He gathered up the letters, carefully placing them in their corresponding envelopes. Charles Augustus will be most interested to read these, he said with a delighted grin. These last two are letters to Jessie from someone else. This one signed, your dying sister, Mary. Good heavens! And one from some minister in the old country. I'll have a look at them later. Tracy returned the papers to the case. Shall I list the other things in the trunk now? I don't think we need to now. You can do that later. There aren't any more papers or any photographs that I could see. Sergeant Corby locked the trunk again before leaving the hotel room. Back in his office, Bill Tracy read Wilson's two forged letters to Jessie. In the one signed, your dying sister Mary, the signature was so shaky it was difficult to read. Tracy shook his head several times while reading the letter. Little did Wilson know, when making references to the Glasgow holiday and other details, that the letter would be read by a sharp-minded Scot with 6 years' experience with the Burgh of Patrick police in Scotland. After reading the minister's letter to Jessie, he sat deep in thought for a time, then scrawled a few lines on a page and tossed the letters into his in-tray. He rolled a legal-sized sheet of paper into his typewriter and began his report to the commissioner. It will be seen that the above letters cover a period commencing in the early part of 1917 until the date of the marriage in 1918. But I noticed that in the letters dated May 1918, Wilson apparently becomes madly infatuated with Miss Patterson and declares that it is impossible for him to live without her. I also draw your attention to the fact that Mary Wilson arrived in Saskatoon in April of 1918, and immediately Wilson redoubles his efforts to gain the hand of Jessie Patterson. I also found 2 typewritten letters alleged to be written from the Royal Infirmary, Glasgow, Scotland. One of these letters is supposed to be written by Wilson's sister, who at the time of writing is supposed to be dying. The letter then goes on to tell Jessie about her brother John's previous marriage, making particular reference to the unfaithfulness of his first wife, and ends by commending Jessie to his care and hopes that they will be happy together. This appears to be a rather peculiar statement for a dying girl to make, as she apparently gives her sanction to her beloved brother committing the crime of bigamy. You will also note that, speaking of the wedding preparations, she states that they cost John several $1,000s. In my experience, it is very rarely that old country people speak of dollars when speaking of money. They always refer to pounds. The second letter, evidently a minister who also appears to be in the possession of the particulars regarding the previous marriage of Wilson and his unhappy marriage with his first wife. This writer also commends Miss Patterson to the care of Wilson and prays for their future happiness. He also gives his sanction to the crime of bigamy being committed, which, to say the least, is a most unusual thing for a minister of the gospel to do. There is no mention of Wilson having obtained a divorce from his first wife. Old country divorces are much more easily obtained than in Canada, and if, as stated, Mary Wilson was of an immoral character, I am of the opinion that it would have been an easy matter for him to have obtained a decree of divorce. That this was not done is evident by Mrs. Wilson's arrival in Regina in April 1918. Another point which strikes me as peculiar is the reference to Wilson meeting Mary Hutchison during the Glasgow holiday and marrying her 10 months later. To my knowledge, the pleasure boats on the River Clyde do not commence until the beginning of June, and what is known as the Glasgow Fair Holidays are an annual event always held from the 10th to the 20th of July, which would put the date of his wedding sometime between March or April 1908. Since he was married on New Year's Day, 1908, I am of the opinion that the story told in this letter was a false one. In a joint patrol on November 21, Sergeant Drysdale and SPP officers Inspector Smith and Sergeant Sparkman drove to Blaine Lake to interview the threshermen once more. As Inspector Smith had not seen the site of the burned car, they drove first to the culvert. The zigzag tracks made by Wilson's car were still visible. The three examined the bushes around the site and those on the way to Isaac Neufeld's, where Wilson had gone for water that morning. A filled-in hole covered with broken branches caused some excitement, but they dug down to sand and clay without result. They again examined the well in the slough. Then, calling at first one farm and then another, they talked to the men who had been there that day. They found Henry Funk out in his shop, oiling a piece of machinery secured in a vise. He waved them to sit wherever they could and carried on with his work. We were first at the machine that morning, Isaac Peters and I. I was running the machine, and it was dark yet, around 5 o'clock. I heard a car going north, traveling real fast with no lights. That would be before 6 o'clock. Then I saw a big smoke go up. Henry waved the oil can, spraying oil in all directions. A big white smoke, and after that a black smoke. A few more drops flew by. By then the other boys were there, and I said, "That's gasoline burning. Let's go down and have a look." When Smith asked Henry about Wilson's actions at the car, he laughed. That guy was drunk. He'd been sick everywhere, and he was acting kind of queer. In what way? Oh, he told different fellows different stories about how the car got there, and he kept going back and forth, getting dirt from under the culvert and throwing it on the car. I guess he was doing it just to be doing something, but he seemed in a daze. Next they went to see Isaac Peters. They sat around the kitchen table, and Mrs. Peters poured them coffee. Then she discreetly withdrew to another part of the house. Peters told them the same story about seeing a car and then smoke. It was just getting light, and I could see one person in it. Then we saw the smoke. Some of the boys got on the elevator to look. The elevator? Sergeant Sparkman asked. Yeah, on a threshing machine. And they saw a big car burning, and there was no car down there when Henry and I passed over the culvert going to work. When asked about Wilson, Peters laughed. That man wasn't sober. He looked like he'd been dragged through a knothole backwards. And he told some funny stories too, that he had geese in the car that burned and so forth. But we would have smelled them. I figured he concocted a story about the car catching fire before he went over the grade, in case somebody asked us. It was a police car he burned up, and he was driving awful darn fast with no lights. At John Neufeld's farm, they talked to John and to Agnes Neufeld, 17 years old next March, who had been in the back seat when her father drove Wilson to Blaine Lake. Drysdale asked if she remembered the drive. Oh yes, the 4 of us were in the back seat. There was a yellow straw valise on the floor with bright red spatters on it. I asked the man Wilson if it was blood, and he took it in the front with him and said it was from the geese. Did he say anything else? I don't think so. He seemed kind of mad that we asked. John Neufeld also remembered Wilson being annoyed that the children had noticed the spots. He again told about Wilson borrowing his coat for the ride and giving him the shovel that he had no more use for when he got out at Blaine Lake. They also talked to Nicholas Bolt, another of the threshers. Detective Sergeant Sparkman, SPP, commented in his report, "It will be particularly noted that Nicholas Bolt says that Wilson had an overcoat on. He thinks a slicker of a light color. This latter should be noted, as subsequent investigation showed that Wilson was supposed to have burned his coat, according to his own statement, and that he borrowed a dark coat from John Neufeld to go to Blaine Lake. The question remains, when did he do away with this coat?" Sparkman concludes his report on the patrol. From the above, it appears established as a fact that Wilson arrived at the spot where the car was burned at about 5:30 a.m. and that the fire was simultaneous. It would now seem certain that the fire was the direct result of the car going over the grade and that the going over was an accident. From all these circumstances, it now appears clear that Wilson would have had no time to do much or any digging in the vicinity where the car burned, and it necessarily follows that the body of Mrs. Wilson is not in the immediate vicinity. This is now beyond conjecture. It will also be noted that apparently Wilson was traveling without headlights, although the time was too dark to do so. This may be that he was wishing to attract as little attention as possible along the road. This also strengthens the theory that the accident and burning was not intentional. Also, the story that Wilson filled a car at Saskatoon early in the morning cannot be substantiated, and was no doubt only said to establish the story that he was at Saskatoon overnight of the 27th, when he was no doubt in the country at some point disposing of his first wife.